Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on biotech and biomanufacturing policy lessons from across the world. On the 20th of March, EU Commissioner Michaela Vestager presented the Commission's long-awaited communication on building the future with nature, boosting biotechnology and biomanufacturing in the EU. And this lays the groundwork for future industrial policy initiatives in the area once a new European Commission has eventually been appointed on the other side of the European elections. But the Commission's recent initiative in this space is by no means the first, and that's why we're hosting this webinar today. In September 2022, the Biden administration announced an executive order on advancing biotechnology and biomanufacturing. And this was followed by an announcement of $2 billion to boost biotech and biomanufacturing as well. Later in March 2023, this was also followed by a report with specific bold goals for biotech and biomanufacturing across key sectors. Similarly, in December 2023, we also had the UK's Department for Science, Innovation and Technology release a national vision for engineering biology, outlining the UK's plans to become an international leader in the field. Both India and China have also in recent years released similar strategies. And I think this growing list of national biotech and biomanufacturing initiatives really speaks to the growing geopolitical importance given to this area or this technology area across multiple different sectors. And to help us make sense of some of these developments, we have invited experts from the US, the UK, and of course also the EU, who've been closely involved in developments of their national initiatives to really give us some insight into the work that they've been doing. So I'd like to start by introducing Carrie Woolanitz, who is Principal and Chair of the Lewisburg Health and Bioscience Innovation Policy Practice Group and former Deputy Director for Health and Life Sciences at the White House Office for Science and Technology Policy, where she's been involved in spearheading the Biden administration's executive order on advancing biotechnology and biomanufacturing. Welcome, Carrie. I'd also like to welcome Aaron Payne, who is International Policy Lead for Engineering Biology at the UK's Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and he's been closely involved in the development of the UK's National Vision for Engineering Biology. So welcome, Aaron. And finally, I'd also like to welcome Hans Ingels, who is Head of Unit in DG Grow of the European Commission, where he's been closely involved in advancing work on the Commission's biotechnology and biomanufacturing initiative. For the audience, I'd just like to let you know that this event will be recorded and we'll also be publishing this on our website afterwards in case you'd like to revisit it. There'll also be an opportunity to ask some questions of our panelists. We're going to field those questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, please make sure to put them in the chat and we'll take care of that. I'd also, before we really properly launch into the discussion, just like to take a moment to clarify what we're talking about when we're talking about biotechnology in this context. Of course, the different initiatives use slightly different terms. We've got engineering biology, biotechnology, biomanufacturing. But essentially in this context, we're talking about the design, the scaling, and the commercialization of biology-derived products and services. And these technologies can be used in quite different areas and quite different sectors, including medical and pharmaceutical applications, in which case we're talking about red biotech, in agri-food, so-called green biotech, and industrial and environmental applications, so-called white biotech, to name just a few possible application areas. So we're really talking about a technology area with broad cross-sectoral application. I'd also like to stress that the initiatives that we'll be discussing today and we'll be getting input on really represent the early steps in the process of developing even more comprehensive biotech and biomanufacturing strategies. And as such, they kind of map out and identify the key challenges and opportunities for facing the development and commercialization of these technologies. In other words, this also means that in years to come, you can expect more initiatives in this area from the different players we've got present today. So that's only exciting, I think. But to actually kick off the discussion, what we're here for, I'd like to start by asking you, Carrie, first, seeing as the Biden administration's executive order came first. I was hoping you could maybe start by explaining why this technology area is important and also what opportunities the Biden administration saw with biotech and biomanufacturing.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here today. I think it is fair to mention that the bioeconomy focus really began during the Obama administration, where there was a national bioeconomy blueprint issued that focused on both innovation and regulation. I think we began to see the emergence of products that didn't squarely fit into sort of our traditional biotechnology silos of health and agriculture. We began to see some crossover there. And so there was an effort to begin to coordinate regulation of biotechnology products during the Obama administration. But this focus on the bioeconomy continued at a slower pace during the Trump administration. And it was really the Biden administration where we recognized that a couple of sort of convergent pieces of evolution were going on. One, the real recognition that we are truly in an age of synthetic and engineering and powerful biotechnology, that all of these many decades of investment in fundamental biological research were really giving us an huge array of tools that could be used for a broad number of applications and products, and that these applications and products had the potential to really address some of our most pressing global challenges. I think this was clearly illustrated during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw rapid acceleration of countermeasures, but really the recognition that this applied to agriculture for food security issues, to climate-friendly products and industrial processes, and that we really needed a whole of government, whole of society effort to address all the pieces of this, from soup to nuts, really, from the investment in the innovation in a really powerful way, to the handoff of development and biomanufacturing and regulation in order to really have a comprehensive effort. And tied to that, and you see this reflected in the executive order, also that in addition to promoting the bioeconomy and promoting these things, that we needed to think about protecting it as well. And that was everything from thinking about economic policy to biosafety and biosecurity policies, so that we were developing these technologies in a responsible and safe way. So the executive order, I have to say, for anybody who studies U.S. executive orders, is quite a beast. It is very, very large and very complex. And so, since then, we have seen, of course, a lot of these follow-on products. You've mentioned the Bold Goals report. There's been a report on data, a report on workforce. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration stood up a national bioeconomy board with senior representatives from across the government to help coordinate all of this. So it is an exciting time, but also a little bit of an uphill battle to make sure we're getting the resources we need to fulfill this vision.
I mean, that's super interesting. And when you do have that executive order in your hand, I can confirm it is a bit of a beast. I would like to also bring you in here, Hans. Carrie's outlined why this technology area is increasingly important. And I'm sure in developing in the European initiative, you've been consulting all sorts of stakeholders to try and understand some of the issues that companies and also researchers are facing in this area. Could you maybe talk a bit more about some of the challenges that you've identified in preparing this initiative?
Yes. Thanks, Emmanuel. First of all, I agree with Carrie on all the opportunities for biotechnology and biomanufacturing, and that I think we all agree that this is such a powerful, innovative field that we all need to support somehow. So I think that we're all on the same page. The challenges might also be quite similar in the US and in the UK. Because I think we're all facing the same, or that the businesses working in biotechnology also face more or less the same challenges, which are, in the first place, bringing research to the market, because I think that we're all very strong in supporting research and that we've got really fantastic researchers. The results are also incredible. But the difficulties are very often how to bring them to the market, because very often the products made on the basis of biotechnology and results of biotechnology, especially in the beginning, are much more expensive to bring them to the market, and they're not necessarily very much welcomed by all the incumbents on the market. So bringing these things to the market, bringing biotechnology and biomanufacturing to the market is difficult. There's also regulatory complexity, and that I think also applies to all countries across the globe, because very often our regulatory framework is not really adapted to innovative products, and then not especially to very innovative biotechnology and biomanufacturing. The businesses themselves have also, especially in Europe, and I think it's less in the US. We do have a problem with fragmented financial markets. So in other words, it's not so easy for an innovative EU startup to find suitable financing in a very fragmented financial environment. And access to finance is in our experience, that's at least what we've heard from businesses, it's not very easy. Something that we all have in common is a problem with skills, finding skilled people, because there's tough competition around the world to attract talent, and this applies as well to the US, to UK, as to the EU. Sometimes I don't know about the US, I don't know about the UK. There might be a perception from public that biotechnology is something very intrusive. Is that it's something very dangerous, and so therefore I think we also have work to do on convincing the public in general about the benefits of biotechnology and biomanufacturing. It's not as intrusive, it's not dangerous. It's simply all these things about biotechnology and biomanufacturing are being tested. And then probably the elephant in the room for many of us is biomass. Is there sufficient biomass for really making a difference and to grow biomanufacturing and to have it as a really economic alternative, for instance, for petrochemicals? Is there sufficient biomass? And if there's insufficient biomass, how do we steer it in the right direction? Because the availability of biomass will all oblige us to make some choices, and these choices will be difficult. And then finally, there's also the challenge of intellectual property, because for a number of biotechnology and a number of biomanufacturing companies, they need to protect their work. They've done valuable research, but then intellectually protecting their work is also sometimes quite difficult.
No, that's super interesting to hear that, and I'd like to bring you in here, Aaron, as well, and also give you an opportunity to jump in. You've heard Carrie and Hans's reflections on some of the challenges and the opportunities in this area. To what extent do these points align with what you guys have in the national vision?
I think there's a huge amount of overlap. Actually, there's sort of 6 chapters of our vision covered research and development, infrastructure, talent and skills, engineering, biology in the economy, which you could really see as kind of market pull through. There was a chapter on regulation and standards and a chapter on responsible and trustworthy innovation. And I think even just by those headings, having a chapter implies that you have challenges in those areas that you want to solve. So I think the overlap is actually is really, really noticeable. I mean, I think all of our we have different, I think, similar strengths, and those are different to some of the rest of the world. Perhaps I think we have very internationalized research and development sectors, for instance, and I think that can be a real advantage, particularly in an arena where we probably are competing for global skills and skills on a global level and will be into the future. So I think there's good reasons for hope actually around this group. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion because I think we've got a lot in common.
Yeah, that's really interesting and good to also have a bit of hope in there. I think there's this one phrase from the national vision that I really like, which is that it is critical to ensure that engineering biology is pulled through to application as much as it's pushed by lab-based discovery. And I think that summarizes that kind of the need for action on both sides really well. But I'd like to go back to you, Carrie, because we've been talking about some of the internal challenges and the opportunities facing this technology area. And we've kind of hinted a bit at the broader international environment. Could you tell us a bit more about how developments outside of the US have influenced the decision to go ahead with this executive order?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the real motivating factors that helped us get this out the door was watching other countries in Europe and Asia develop their own biotechnology strategies. I think, this was coming on the heels in the US of this massive chips and science bill, which was really focused on the semiconductor industry. And the narrative there was, the US had invented sort of this industry, invented the underlying technology, and then, let it slip away, essentially outsource the manufacturing of it to other countries. And now we were left in a position for a number of reasons of wanting to bring it back and having to put forward massive investments. And with biotechnology, there was a similar sense that we were, headed down that pathway where there was an industry that had strong roots in U.S. fundamental research, and we had a strong history of supporting biotechnology, but we were, potentially letting other countries, really surge forward in a way that I think, as much as we see this as a global endeavor, and we really do, I think international cooperation in biotechnology is really critical to the entire ecosystem. There was also this, co-opetition sense of we wanted to make sure that the U.S. maintains a strong leadership role here, and so it was really watching, whether that was the establishment of biofoundries or China putting forth strategies in biotechnology that really helped motivate getting the executive order across the finish line.
No, that's super interesting, and I think we're veering towards this question because I think in our future work we'd also quite like to broaden the scope, at least our future work, I think Tank Europa, to include other players as well. Obviously China, India, Japan are all coming with some really important initiatives here, but that's beyond the scope of this webinar. But I'd quite like to hear from you guys, and I'd like to start by hearing from you, Aaron. To what extent in this crowded field full of competitors and cooperation, to what extent do you guys see yourselves as partners in this, or cooperating, and to what extent are you competitors?
I think you'd have to say both, if you're being honest, wouldn't you? And I love the phrase of coopetition, which is a new one on me, but I think a really good one. The UK has pretty clear data that in terms of research development, we're pretty much the most cooperative nation in the world. So we have always seen sort of international cooperation in research and development as completely essential to the things that we are trying to do, and that isn't going to change. And I think there are some sort of clear challenges that we all have an equal stake in, I would think, which is the public trust element, which has been discussed. You need a global market full of consumers and large companies that are switched on to this stuff, trust it, and want to use it, buy it, sell it. So I think the overlap there is pretty complete. We all have an interest in averting unintended consequences from the development, use, and deployment of these technologies, which links directly back, I think, to the public trust point, and probably a lot of overlapping security interests to a great extent as well. So I think the sort of the space for political cooperation is huge, and I think the space for economic competition is likely to be healthy and constructive because it will in itself promote the development of this global bioeconomy.
That's interesting to hear. Hans, I'd like to hear your answer to this question as well.
Thanks, Emmanuel. I agree with what Aaron said. I think that we as public authorities, with all our international partners, and we named some in the communication, especially the US, but also Japan, South Korea, and many others, we do have an interest to cooperate because all our businesses work at a global level. And try to sell also at a global level. Also, our regulatory systems are quite similar. And we share the same objectives. So there, I think there's a large scope for cooperation. Obviously, our companies compete, and our companies compete globally. So there, there's a lot of potential for competition. But this is also how our general mindset is. This is a cooperative at regulatory level and at authority level. And we do admire and welcome competition at the business level.
And now that I've given the others now that both Hans and Aaron have had the opportunity to answer it, would you like to chip in as well, Carrie, or do you feel the others have covered your thinking pretty well there?
I think they've said it well.
Brilliant. In that case, I'd like to follow up with a question for you, another question for you, Hans, because in the Danish debate, when we're discussing this technology area, we very much tend to focus on the sustainability and the potential sustainability uses of biotech and biomanufacturing. It's very much a debate about competitiveness and the potential economic gains that might come with the success of this area. But what seems to feature quite prominently across these different strategies is the question of economic security and security implications that we've already touched on a little bit. But sticking to the economic security part of that, in the case of the EU initiative, why is it important from an economic security perspective, Hans?
Biotechnology was identified as one of the 10 critical technology areas for European economic security. Because it's also due to the power of the technology itself, its transformative nature, but also the potential risk of civil and military fusion of some biotechnologies. And this is something that we shouldn't ignore. And the risk of their misuse for human rights violations. So biotechnology is very powerful, but can also be very powerful in a negative sense. In addition, we all learned during the COVID crisis that sometimes for certain types of manufacturing, we highly depend on value chains that might be less reliable than we had hoped for. So that there also economic security has become an item. Also, you see that global value chains have become much more vulnerable than they were in the past. We've also seen what happened in the Suez Canal, and whatever happens in the Red Sea has major consequences also on Europe. Another important element is that the aggression of and the invasion of Ukraine, where we also learned that we might have been too overly dependent on fossil resources coming, for instance, from Russia. And fossil resources, and here, as this is where biotechnology can play a very, very important role, is to replace the use of fossil resources by, for instance, biomass, where we need biotechnology. In other words, it's important for, and there the objectives somewhat come together. It's important for the competitiveness of our businesses that we always have somewhere an alternative available in a global environment that is less friendly than it was several years ago.
That's really interesting. I'd like to just to park the security question for a moment and move on to some of the regulatory challenges that we've also been touching on. Reading the UK's national vision, we see that inefficient regulations and standards is highlighted as one of those areas where there's scope for improvement. And in this context, the UK national vision really focuses also on retained EU regulation, and I think what you in the strategy call the EU's precautionary mindset as a potential obstacle or challenge that's still to be overcome in the UK today. And I mean, we've already seen the UK in different ways try to capitalize on some of these post-Brexit freedoms. For instance, we've seen, movement on the precision breeding bill, or what we in an EU context would call new genomic techniques. But could you tell me a bit more about what sorts of post-Brexit regulatory opportunities that you might see in this area, Aaron?
Yeah, so just to say a bit about that sort of Genetic Precision Act that came out in 2023. I mean, we view that as a major step for us in terms of unlocking growth and innovation in new technologies and reinforcing food security as well. I think Brexit generally is kind of an opportunity to rethink our regulations sort of from first principles, and I suppose the Genetic Technology Act is an example of that. There's a kind of long background in this area for us because there was a particularly UK-centric scandal around brouhaha, if you like, around genetically modified food back in the sort of early 2000s, late 1990s. That cast quite a long scar, and I think is in the back of our minds as we seek to regulate in this area. Although I think the debate in the UK has significantly moved on, and I think there's now a lot more. There's a lot less instinctive aversion than I think there was at the time to some of these technologies. But I mean, we've seen organisations like the Food Standards Agency agreeing a first set of post-Brexit reforms, and we know that novel foods is a massive opportunity in this area, and one in which the UK looks to countries like the US and sees cultivated meat coming onto the market in the US and in Singapore, and I think in Israel as well, and sees that we've got some incredibly exciting companies in the UK. Hoxton Farms, Ivy Farms would be two that I would mention, who can do this stuff, but they can't currently bring it to the market. So I think that would be one area we'd certainly be looking at.
That's really interesting. And I think, as when we start to talk about precision breeding, new genomic techniques, the question of public opinion that we've already touched on, again comes up. I think this is something that seems to feature particularly in the EU strategy, but in the other, well, not strategy, the European communication on this, although it may also feature indirectly in some of the others. I was wondering, Hans, could you say a little bit more about how the question of public opinion potentially features in the EU communication?
Yeah, it features quite prominently because and this probably goes for all Western countries where we still have some convincing to do to convince the general public that biotechnology is something extremely useful for society in general. There will always be people who will continue having doubts on the benefits of biotechnology and biomanufacturing, but there's a specific role for us, public authorities and governments, to explain to public that we rely much more on biotechnology and biomanufacturing than people generally think, and that there is a misconception, and that people should not be afraid of biotechnology because it's all about biology. We're all biological beings, and we eat food. We take medicines. So overall, we use personal care products. In other words, we use a lot of biological resources which are are already biotechnology in a certain way, or biomanufacturing. But as far as we are concerned, this is a second step. I think the first concern that we all should try to address is how can we encourage these products to come to the market? Because as long as they're not on the market, the issue of the public concern will still remain. I think once that there will be much more on the shelves and that people can try them, and then that people and that also businesses can sell them, people will get used to much more products which are bio-based and which rely on biotechnology or which are biomanufactured. So, in other words, let's try from the beginning, ensure that these products get to the market, and then I guess public will get used to it. They will see them more and more, and they can buy them, and then the mindsets will probably change. This is at least what I hope.
Yeah, no, I think it'll be interesting, especially if, Aaron, you mentioned the example of cell-based meat or lab-grown meat. If that suddenly makes its way to the market in in the UK, for instance, in coming years. I think that could really bring that kind of product a lot closer to European consumers and start to prompt some thinking about new products like that from a European side. But Carrie, I'd like to bring you in here, because streamlining and adapting regulation to this new technology area is really something that features quite prominently in both the UK and the EU strategies in this area. And one thing they also have in common is that they reference the US as an example of a jurisdiction where you guys seem to have gotten a lot right. You know, there's a fair amount of praise for the US model in when it comes to regulating biotech. But when I sit down and read the executive order, I'm of course also struck by the fact that you guys have your own regulatory challenges that you're dealing with in a US context. So my first question would really be, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what's the US doing right in this area? And then we can move on to some reflections on where the executive order sees room for potential improvement.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's delightful to hear praise, because I only ever hear the complaints. So this is a lovely change of pace. Yeah, I think, in some ways, the U.S. has the benefit of historically not having that same public conversation around biotechnology as was just described in the European context. I think some of that might be born out of willful ignorance. I think Americans don't spend a lot of time thinking about where their food and medical products come from, so much as they just want them to be safe and available and affordable. And we have had, particularly again in the health and agriculture space, a very long history of oversight of these initial biotechnology products, which have, were originally sort of very context specific. The medical products were treated as non-biological medical products were treated, and that worked fairly well. And similarly in agriculture, with an established regulatory system, and by and large, that has for a long time worked well. Where we suffer challenges in the US is what I would call this newer generation of biotechnology products that are beginning to challenge the boxes that we have created for our regulators, where you have, say, drug products developed in food animals, and it really begins to cross the boundaries of some of our regulatory agencies in a way that it makes it hard both for the developer community and the regulators to know who has the ball, essentially, who under what regulatory agency does this fall, and what is the best oversight framework to use for some of these crossover products that kind of challenge our entry points of regulation. And the approach that, as I mentioned, it sort of began in the Obama administration, was that of coordination, which is a lovely word. We all like to coordinate. The problem with that, and I just want to pause and say, it is really easy to get mad at regulators, but recognizing they have very hard jobs with this balance of getting products to market while also protecting the public for whom they work. I think there were a lot of sort of turf issues among, our regulatory agencies across government, where they felt very strongly that they should be the kind of lead regulatory authority for any given product. And so there would be a lot of coordination in that they would spend a lot of time talking to each other, but it created almost a paralysis, which was a quagmire for actually moving products forward. And that remains to this day. And if anything, it's getting more challenging, because we're seeing more and more products that are so innovative that they don't easily fit into the sort of regulatory frameworks. And it is very difficult in the US system for regulators across these different agencies to really work together in an effective way. So a lot of what the executive order is trying to do, and this is still very much a work in progress, is creating mechanisms that allow regulators to work better together and ultimately, hopefully, create some sort of, decision-making mechanism so that at some point we stop this kind of wheel-spinning, paralyzing conversation and give developers a clear path forward as to, which agency will be regulating them, what that timeline looks like, and a path to get through that kind of paralyzing quagmire.
I mean, that's really interesting to hear. I'd be keen to also to hear from either you, Aaron, or Hans, as these types of very innovative crossover, biotechnological products. Are regulators in either the UK or the EU jurisdiction meeting these and facing similar challenges with that?
Yeah, I can come in on that. I mean, one of our recent innovations, I suppose, is something called the Engineering Biology Regulators Network, which meets monthly, and the sort of regulatory soup of agencies in the UK that have equities in this area meet in that forum. There's a kind of dedicated work plan in terms of reference behind it, and then the money, it's a sort of a modest £5 million, but actually for a regulator that's not bad. For sandboxes, which are, it's a pretty broad term, but experimental approaches to regulation, and that's a competed fund. So we've got regulators kind of bidding in with proposals for how they might try different things in this area, and then we will fund the products that we think are kind of best strategic fit for us. I think the regulatory coordination around this is genuine. Like, as Carrie said, it's hard, and there are really, really good reasons for regulators sometimes to want to move slowly. But if we're going to unlock all this massive potential, sometimes we need them to move a bit more quickly. So yeah, that's what we're doing in this area.
I mean, that's really interesting. Reading the EU strategy regulatory sandboxes is also something that's discussed there, right? I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on that, Hans. What potential role do you guys see for something like regulatory sandboxes in an EU context?
There's a lot of potential in regulatory sandboxes. Obviously, for innovative products, because for innovative products would be a very good idea. We're facing difficult choices as a regulator, because on the one hand, we want to have predictability, we want to have regulatory stability, we don't want to change the law every 5 minutes. So in other words, we want to have certain stability for businesses. The difficulty with innovative companies is that sometimes, as Aaron already said, they really don't fit into, or they don't fit very well into the existing structure, because their products are very, very, very new. And then usually we try to find an informal solution where to somehow fit these into guidance or to market surveillance authorities, so that they more or less agree on a common approach of this among all the different member states. But it's clear that in certain cases we could benefit from much more regulatory sandboxes, also in order to allow member states to permit these products to enter the market under very specific circumstances. There are already a few examples of regulatory sandboxes in the EU law, and I believe that this will be also a future model, because it's important also in a single market where products can move freely. And single market is an extended single market. It's not only the EU, but we also have Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, to a certain extent also Switzerland. Turkey is also applying a lot of EU law. So it's there that we somehow in regulatory sandboxes have a system whereby all surveillance authorities are very well informed that certain products are part of regulatory sandboxes, so that they know if these products move around, that they're part of the sandbox. But I do believe that there's a lot of potential in the idea for the future.
No, that's really interesting, and I think it's interesting when you're dealing with a technology area like this, where things are moving so quickly, where the applications really are found across multiple different sectors, trying to do some of that coordinating work. I'd like to, in connection with that, come back to a phrase that you brought up earlier, Carrie, and that also features in the executive order, this idea of a whole of government approach, right? I see that kind of reflected a little bit also in the discussion of of coordinating, but also kind of coordinating effectively. But I was wondering, could you say a little bit more about why this whole of government approach is needed, and what exactly you mean by that when you use that phrase?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most exciting things about biotechnology is the fact that we have these fundamental technologies that can be used across a broad number of applications that present solutions to this huge number of challenges in ways that we probably haven't even imagined yet, because it is very much innovation happening as we speak. And, you know, the structure of the US government, and probably structure of many governments, is, of course, far more rigid than that, in the sense that, you know, we have these mission-driven agencies, all of whom have this kind of piece of the puzzle, whether that is the National Institutes of Health focused on sort of biomedical applications of biotechnology, or, you know, the National Science Foundation, which might be developing climate or industrial applications, Department of Energy with biofuels, et cetera, and then, of course, I've already mentioned the siloed nature of our regulatory agencies. And so the executive order really brought this sense of, this isn't any one department or agency's job to do alone to really incentivize a robust biotechnology and biomanufacturing sector, and think about all of these various pieces to make that happen. But it really did require thinking across those traditional silos, and creating effective mechanisms to work collectively across the agencies in terms of moving the strategy forward. And also a nod that it's not government alone's to do, that this is really a public-private venture in a lot of ways. And, you know, when you look back to the big summit we had where we released the executive order, you know, industry featured quite prominently in those conversations, born out of recognition that this is not really just a whole of government approach. You know, at the White House, that's what is in the power to control, but really a whole of society and ecosystem approach that involves strengthening these public-private partnership opportunities.
No, that's super interesting, and I think I'm also aware, in terms of timing, that Hans, that you will probably soon have to leave. So I want to make sure to direct some questions to Hans, because he has to leave a little bit early. And one thing I'd like to ask here is, because we've already had different, you know, bioeconomy, biotech-related initiatives in the past. And from the EU side, you had this big bioeconomy strategy back in 2012. This has since been updated, faced a large update in 2018. Kind of bringing together some of the different bits of the discussion that we've had. Hans, I'd be keen to hear your reflections. Why was there a need from the EU side for a new strategy, right? What's kind of changed there, either internally or externally, or both for that matter?
Yeah. This is not new bioeconomy strategy. The Commission will publish a new bioeconomy strategy in 2025. This is only covering, and it's more an intermediate report on all the work that we're doing on biotechnology and biomanufacturing, which is a part of the bioeconomy. There's plenty of other elements in the bioeconomy, food, feed, and energy, where things are going quite well. What we try to focus here is specific elements of the bioeconomy. It's biotechnology, biomanufacturing, where indeed more work needs to be done to bring these products to the market. And this was a bit in the overall bioeconomy strategy. It was there, but it was less visible, because the bioeconomy strategy is quite holistic and covers everything that is in the bioeconomy, which is enormous in Europe. But here we wanted to be very specific on biotechnology and biomanufacturing, which have specific needs, which other parts of the bioeconomy might not have, for instance, renewable energies. So this is work in progress. And we will somehow, together with other work streams, fit in the new industrial strategy, but also in the new bioeconomy strategy under the new European Parliament and also under the new European Commission.
No, I think that's really interesting, and kind of reading across these different initiatives. I mean, here in Think Tank Europa, we do also see this as part of a broader tendency for governments to select strategically important industries based on their potential contribution to economic competitiveness, the green transition, security-related matters, and really taking measures to develop and maintain domestic production capacity specifically, right? And some people would call this industrial policy, and I think Harry already mentioned the example of similar initiatives, for instance, within advanced semiconductors, but it could also be in areas like batteries. But just because we have you here, Hans, for a little bit longer, in the communication, you do mention this possibility eventually of an EU Biotech Act, and I know, as you said, the usual caveats of we have a European parliamentary election. We also need to have a new commission. Where do you see this area, and how do you see it developing in years to come from the European side?
That's difficult to say. What we need to do now is to have a good discussion, a good consultation with industry, with interested parties, and also with international parties and international partners on what could we do to support biotechnology and biomanufacturing. That could be done in different ways. That could be through financial support. That could be done through fast permitting. That could also be done through market measures. That could be done to stronger IP protection. There's several possibilities. But what we will not be doing is, again, is regulate very, very broadly. What we will do, if we need to do something, it will be very targeted. The model, it will be probably more or less inspired by the Net Zero Industry Act, if we would like to do something, which is a mixture of support, push measures to support industry to get their products to the market. Sometimes also simplification, and in very specific fields. For instance, the introduction of regulatory sandboxes is something that would typically fit into EU Biotech Act, because you need legislation to incorporate regulatory sandboxes and to organize them somehow in a single market. But this is very, very premature, because we need, and this is what we all do in Western democracies. If you do something, first of all, you have to do a very broad consultation to identify what is necessary, to identify what is useful, but also to identify all possible collateral damage that you might cause by ideas which at first sight look very interesting, but as upon reflection might not be as beneficial as one would think from the outset. So it's very early days, but it's clear that we will be launching the entire reflection on how could we promote, how could we support, with two specific angles in mind. And the one hand is single market, and the other one is competitiveness of mainly SMEs, because this is also something that we have to keep in mind here, is that many of the promising startups in the field of biotechnology and biomanufacturing are often SMEs, which have even bigger challenges than larger companies. Access to finance, access to information, access to skills. In other words, these would be the type of businesses that on which we would spend most of our attention. And with these two perspectives, this is the process that we've launched. And then during the coming, I would say, 12 to 1 year, 1.5 years, the entire consultation process should identify what needs to be done. And on that basis, we'll have to see whether a possible EU Biotech Act is something useful. And if it's not useful, we'll simply not be doing it.
Okay, no, that's even more concrete than I was hoping for. So thank you so much for being willing to venture there, Hans. Really appreciate it.
I need to leave now, unfortunately.
Please go for it. It was a pleasure having you on the call. I'm glad we could just fit in a last couple of questions for you there.
Okay.
For the audience, the rest of our panelists will be staying on for another 10 minutes, so don't you worry. Carrie, I would like to go back to you now. I know we've already touched on some of the economic security related questions that we've been discussing today. But I think reading the Biden administration's executive order, I really think this is, out of the different strategies as I read them, security considerations, security concerns really do feature most prominently there. And I'd be very keen to hear some of your reflections on what exactly are these security concerns, and perhaps even if you have an example of what that could look like, seeing as it can be quite abstract with these new and developing technology areas.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's absolutely right. I think there is this, again, kind of modality of promotion and protection, and protection can mean, protecting economic interests, but also, biosecurity questions around emerging biotechnologies. Issues of dual use in biotechnology is not a new issue, and certainly not a new policy topic in the US. We've been talking about that related to pathogens for a long time, and I think that has created this overall recognition that these are incredibly powerful technologies that can be used for great benefit, but could also potentially be misused for harm, whether that is engineering a highly virulent pathogen, whether that is thinking about how you misuse someone's sensitive genomic information potentially. And so, or even this intersection of biosafety and biosecurity, where, potentially as we think about new biotechnologies, maybe something like gene drives, we might need new containment strategies for both biosafety and biosecurity reasons as these technologies advance. And so in many ways, I think the executive order reflects this idea of trying to get ahead of the curve. I think the American expression is not closing the barn door after the horse has escaped, but really making sure that we are putting into place the guide rails, so as this technology develops, it's doing so safely and securely, and that we're thinking about that in advance. I think we, like many other countries, have a tendency to create policy through knee-jerk reaction, where something bad happens and then we react to it and put new oversight mechanisms in place. In this case, it's the idea that the science and security go hand in hand, and that you really want to pay attention to potential security issues even as you're developing the technology, and try to get ahead of them.
Right, and I mean that's interesting, right? To trying to get ahead of those developments, but before you're standing with the problem, and it's kind of too late, right? This is, as I've been reading the national vision from the UK side, Aaron, this is also something that features in some of your work when you're kind of considering questions of responsible research and innovation. How are you guys trying to get ahead of some of these potential problems with the technology area?
Probably I'd highlight two things. I think one is that, so going back to 2012, when the UK made some really significant investments in synthetic biology research and development, there was an early emphasis on the social sciences. So when we set up 6 centres of excellence around the UK, those included funding for social science. So to some extent in the UK, social scientists and natural scientists have been working hand in hand, which means there are quite strong norms around responsible research and innovation in the UK. I mean, I think I wouldn't for a second suggest we've kind of fixed it, that will need to be something that's nurtured in all countries, I think, in an ongoing way. But I think particularly that's not something that has been done everywhere historically. And then secondly, sort of again, a recent initiative of ours is to set up the Biosecurity Leadership Council, which the Science Minister chairs again on a monthly basis. And that includes senior members of the research and business community who come in once a month for a group chaired by the Science Minister, and they consider various different sort of risks associated with the development of these technologies precisely so that we can try and get ahead. It's exactly what Carrie was saying. If you know about them in advance, you're not making knee-jerk policies, your policy can account for them. And then finally, I think it's important here to talk about the international level. So if you look at organizations like the OECD, there is a bio-focused working group of experts at the Global Forum on Technology, which actually is wider than the OECD membership. So is a kind of chance to have a sort of multi-stakeholder and broader international coalition rooted in OECD sort of values about what the future governance of some of these technologies should look like and what the risks are that are likely to emerge. And I think it really does need to be an international conversation, because biology can travel across borders, as we saw during COVID. So it's a sort of fundamentally international conversation.
That's super interesting. If we have time, I might return to that point on international cooperation, but I'm aware that we're running a bit short of time here, and we've got some questions in the chat that I'd like to pose to you guys. The first one we've got is on a point we touched on earlier related to regulatory sandboxes. And the question here is, does this approach not risk creating a market for buying and lobbying one's way into this space, where financially strong innovators receive sandbox space rather than the most important promising technologies? How can you ensure that resources are not wasted on lobbying and it doesn't skew competition? I know the UK has some previous experiences with regulatory sandboxes. So I was maybe thinking, Aaron, if you'd like to have a first stab at that one.
Yeah, this is one of the areas where I slightly reached the limit of my skill and experience. I'm afraid I'm not a specialist in regulatory sandboxes. What I would say from I think a sort of generic policy perspective is I can't imagine that the risks that the question is pointing to are sharper or more troubling in the area of biotechnology than they kind of would be anywhere else. And so, I think regulatory sandboxes are a well-established policy mechanism, and so I think there are, people know how to run these in a way which delivers the best policy outcomes.
Is there anything you'd like to add here, Carrie? Or I know that the sandboxes don't feature in the US initiative, so it was just in case you had any special knowledge. And I'd just like to, on the point of regulatory sandboxes, underscore Aaron's point there that this is quite a tried and tested instrument. It's been also tried in an EU context in different policy areas. As was mentioned by Hans earlier. It's also something that we're interested in here in Tank Europa. So we are hoping to potentially do some more work on regulatory sandboxes and also kind of explore how they've been used previously. Before getting on to we've got one more question as well relating to developments in artificial intelligence and the development of the bioeconomy. This is something that I felt came across very strongly in the UK strategy as well. So I know I'm piling quite a lot of questions on you here, Aaron, but I hope that's okay, because that's where they seem to be relevant. If you could tap a bit more, tell us a little bit more about the potential synergies that you see between biotech and developments in artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and I'm sure Carrie would have a huge amount to say here as well. Convergence in general is probably the place to go with this. I think particularly the convergence of robotics and AI and biology now. You are looking towards a future where 4,000 people with pipettes and 4 years of work is compressed into automated processes and predictive models for experimentation. So a lot of wasted work just doesn't happen because the AI has guided you towards more predictive, more sort of productive results. I think you're going to be looking at biology companies where actually the vast majority of the workforce is sat behind computers rather than in the lab. The opportunities of the convergence of AI and biology are, I think, enormous. Like all aspects of this thing, there are also, some potential associated risks with that. I think there's an ongoing international expert conversation about the extent to which those have been sort of overstated or how credible they are and all the rest of it. But I know that both in the UK and in the US, people will be thinking about that.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Carrie?
Yeah, well, I would just say that private industry is voting with its feet in this space. It seems like every day there's a new company springing up at this intersection of AI and biotechnology and a variety of applications, as Aaron just described. I'll note that one thing we haven't touched on, but in the US we have this major congressional commission, the National Commission for Security on Emerging Biotechnologies, which has been tasked with making legislative recommendations related to the bioeconomy. And a lot of the actual people who were in the administration working on the EO have now drifted to the commission. So there's a lot of connection between the two in terms of personnel, and the intersection of AI and bio is a major focus of their work. And they've put out a series of white papers on that topic because it is of such strong interest.
I mean, that's hugely interesting, and definitely we've been reading some of the work from that commission, but definitely something we'll be following up even more, as it seems to be an area where, like you said, industry really is voting with its feet. But that brings us towards the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much for your participation. It's been an absolute pleasure having you both here for this webinar. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope that that's also been the case for the people listening in. As I said, we'll be summarizing some of the key points discussed during this webinar on our website, where a recording of this conversation will also be available in case there's anything you'd like to go back over and listen into, because we have covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much, everyone, for your participation, and have a great day.